The morning sun cast long shadows across the naval base as Team 7 prepared for their routine security briefing. The air was thick with the familiar smell of salt water and diesel fuel that every SEAL knew by heart. Lieutenant Jake Morrison adjusted his gear one final time before heading into the command center, his mind already focused on the day's mission parameters. As the team gathered around the briefing table, their attention was drawn to an unusual sight in the corner of the room. An elderly man, probably in his 70s, sat quietly on a metal folding chair. His weathered hands rested on a wooden cane, and his eyes held the kind of depth that comes from seeing too much of the world. He wore a simple gray sweater and dark pants, nothing that would typically draw attention in a military setting. What caught the SEAL's eyes, however, was the faded tattoo visible on the old man's forearm. It was partially obscured by his sleeve, but they could make out what appeared to be an anchor with some kind of rope design wrapped around it. The ink had blurred with age, making the details difficult to distinguish, but there was something about it that seemed oddly familiar, yet different from the typical naval tattoos they were accustomed to seeing. Petty Officer First Class. Marcus Rodriguez was the first to notice it clearly. He nudged his teammate, signaling with his eyes toward the elderly visitor. Soon, several members of the team were stealing glances at the mysterious marking on the man's arm. The tattoo looked old, really old, like it had been etched into his skin decades ago when tattoo artistry was far more primitive than today's sophisticated designs. The old man seemed completely unaware of the attention he was receiving. He sat perfectly still, occasionally shifting his weight on the uncomfortable chair, but otherwise maintaining the kind of composure that suggested he was no stranger to military environments. His presence in their briefing room was puzzling enough, but the strange tattoo added another layer of mystery to an already unusual morning. Seaman Jake Patterson, one of the younger members of the team, couldn't contain his curiosity any longer. He had spent years studying military history and naval traditions, and something about that tattoo was nagging at him. The design elements were familiar, but they were arranged in a way he had never seen before. It was as if someone had taken traditional naval symbols and twisted them into something entirely different. The briefing hadn't officially started yet, so Patterson decided to approach the elderly man. He walked over with the confident stride that came naturally to all SEALs, but there was a respectful hesitation in his manner as he got closer. Military protocol dictated certain courtesies when dealing with civilian visitors, especially elderly ones who might be veterans themselves. "Excuse me, sir," Patterson said, his voice carrying the polite but direct tone that SEALs were trained to use in uncertain situations. "I couldn't help but notice your tattoo there. That's quite an interesting design. Mind if I ask where you got it done?" The old man looked up slowly, his pale blue eyes meeting Patterson's with a steadiness that was almost unsettling. For a moment he didn't respond, as if he was carefully considering whether or not to engage in conversation. When he finally spoke, his voice was surprisingly strong for someone his age, with just a hint of an accent that was difficult to place. "This old thing?" he said, glancing down at his forearm with what might have been amusement. "Got it a long time ago, son. Different world back then, different rules." His response only deepened the mystery. Patterson found himself studying the tattoo more closely now that he had permission to look. The anchor was definitely there, but the ropework around it was unlike anything he had seen in naval tradition. There were also what appeared to be small symbols or numbers worked into the design, but they were so faded that he couldn't make them out clearly. By this time, other members of the team had taken notice of the conversation. Rodriguez moved closer, followed by Petty Officer Second Class David Chen and Seaman First Class Tommy Williams. They formed a loose semicircle around the old man's chair, their curiosity now fully engaged. Each of them had their own theories about what they were seeing, but none of them were quite ready to voice their suspicions. The elderly visitor seemed to sense their growing interest, and a small smile played at the corners of his mouth. It wasn't a mocking smile, but rather the kind of expression that suggested he was enjoying a private joke that nobody else was in on. He shifted slightly in his chair, causing his sleeve to ride up just a bit more, revealing additional elements of the tattoo that had been hidden moments before. What they saw next made several of the SEALs exchange meaningful glances. There were definitely numbers incorporated into the design, and what looked like it might be a date. The style of the tattoo work itself was clearly from an earlier era, probably the 1940s or 1950s, based on the techniques and ink quality that were typical of that time period. Patterson was about to ask another question when the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the hallway outside the briefing room. The distinctive cadence could only belong to one person, Commander Sarah Mitchell, their commanding officer. She was known throughout the base for her no-nonsense approach to leadership and her encyclopedic knowledge of naval history and tradition. The SEALs instinctively straightened up as the footsteps grew closer. Commander Mitchell was respected by everyone under her command, not just for her tactical expertise, but for her ability to see details that others missed. If anyone could solve the mystery of the old man's tattoo, it would be her. As the commander's silhouette appeared in the doorway, the old man's demeanor changed subtly. He sat up a little straighter, and his eyes focused on the approaching officer with what seemed like recognition, though none of the SEALs could understand how that was possible. They had never seen this elderly visitor before, and as far as they knew, neither had their commander. The stage was set for a revelation that none of them could have anticipated. Commander Mitchell entered the briefing room with her usual purposeful stride, carrying a thick folder of mission documents under her arm. She took in the scene quickly, noting how her team had gathered around the elderly visitor instead of preparing for their briefing. Her sharp eyes immediately assessed the situation, looking for any potential security concerns or protocol violations. "Good morning, gentlemen," she said in her clear, authoritative voice. "I see you've met our guest." Her tone suggested that the old man's presence wasn't as unexpected as the SEALs had assumed. She set her folder down on the briefing table and turned her full attention to the small group gathered around the metal chair. Patterson stepped forward slightly, his curiosity getting the better of military protocol. "Commander, we were just asking this gentleman about his tattoo. It's quite unusual, and we were wondering about its history." He gestured toward the old man's forearm, where the mysterious ink was still partially visible beneath the rolled-up sleeve. Commander Mitchell's expression remained neutral, but there was something in her eyes that suggested she knew more than she was letting on. She approached the elderly visitor, who had remained seated throughout the exchange. As she got closer, the old man looked up at her with what the SEALs could now clearly see was recognition. "Sir," the commander said, her voice carrying a note of respect that surprised her team, "would you mind showing these men your tattoo properly? I think they deserve to understand what they're looking at." The request was phrased politely, but it carried the weight of an order. The old man nodded slowly and began rolling up his sleeve with deliberate care. As more of the tattoo became visible, the SEALs could see that it was far more complex than they had initially realized. The design covered most of his forearm, and what they had thought was simple rope work was actually an intricate pattern of symbols and numbers. As the sleeve rolled higher, Rodriguez gasped audibly. What he was seeing didn't match any naval tattoo he had ever encountered, but it was definitely military in nature. The anchor was there as they had observed, but it was surrounded by symbols that looked almost like code. There were small eagles, crossed rifles, and what appeared to be parachutes worked into the design. Chen leaned forward for a better look, his eyes widening as he began to make sense of what he was seeing. "Is that?" he started to say, then stopped himself, unwilling to voice what he was thinking. The implications were too extraordinary to believe. Williams, who had remained quiet up to this point, suddenly understood what he was looking at. His grandfather had told him stories, old stories that he had always assumed were exaggerated. Stories about men who had operated in complete secrecy during the war, men whose very existence was denied by official records. Stories about operations that were so classified that even decades later, no one spoke about them openly. The old man finished rolling up his sleeve, revealing the complete tattoo in all its faded glory. Now the SEALs could see everything: the anchor, the eagles, the parachutes, and most importantly, the numbers. The date was clearly visible now, 1943. But it was the other symbols that made their hearts race. Small tridents, barely visible in the aged ink, worked into the design in places where only someone who knew what to look for would notice them. Patterson's mind was racing as he tried to process what he was seeing. The trident was the symbol of the SEALs, but the SEALs hadn't been officially established until 1962. How could a tattoo from 1943 contain their symbol? Unless, Commander Mitchell watched as understanding slowly dawned on her team's faces. She had known this moment would come eventually, when the old secrets would need to be shared with a new generation. The elderly man sitting before them represented a piece of history that most people would never know existed. "Gentlemen," she said quietly, "meet Frank Morrison. He's 91 years old, and until recently his service record was completely classified." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. Frank was part of the original underwater demolition teams that operated during World War II. But his unit was special. Even among the UDT teams, the old man, Frank, smiled slightly as he watched the young SEALs struggle to understand. He had been keeping secrets for so long that it felt strange to have them revealed, even to these elite warriors who carried on the traditions he had helped establish. Rodriguez found his voice first. "Sir, are you saying that you were—" He couldn't finish the sentence. The implications were too overwhelming. Frank nodded slowly. "I was part of what they called the maritime unit of the OSS," he said, his voice carrying the weight of decades. "We did things that nobody talked about in places that didn't officially exist. We were the ghosts of the ocean, son. We went where nobody else could go, and we did what nobody else could do." The Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, was the precursor to the CIA. The maritime unit had been its most secretive branch, conducting operations that were so classified that even their existence was denied. These men had been the prototype for what would eventually become the Navy SEALs, but they had operated in complete darkness, without recognition or official acknowledgement. Chen stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "The tattoo, those symbols, every man in our unit got one," Frank explained. "It was the only way we had to recognize each other if we were captured or separated. The symbols told a story that only we could read. The anchor represented our naval service, the eagles showed we were airborne qualified, the parachutes marked us as special operations, and the tridents." He paused, touching the faded ink gently. "The tridents were our own addition. We knew we were creating something new, something that would outlast the war." Williams felt a chill run down his spine. "How many of you were there?" Frank's expression grew somber. 237 men started the program," he said quietly. 43 of us made it to the end of the war. I'm the last one left." The briefing room fell completely silent as the magnitude of what they were hearing sank in. These young SEALs, who had trained for years to earn their tridents, were standing in the presence of the man who had helped design the very symbol they wore with such pride. Commander Mitchell stepped forward. "Frank has been trying to connect with active SEAL teams for the past few years. He wanted to share some of the techniques and knowledge that his unit developed, things that were never officially documented. When I heard about his request, I knew you men needed to meet him." Patterson looked down at his own uniform, at the trident pin that marked him as a Navy SEAL, then back at the elderly man whose tattoo contained the same symbol from nearly 8 decades ago. The connection between past and present was overwhelming. The weight of Frank's revelation settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Each SEAL was processing the information in his own way, trying to reconcile what they thought they knew about their history with this extraordinary new truth. Commander Mitchell gestured toward the chairs around the briefing table, inviting everyone to sit down for what was clearly going to be a much longer conversation than anyone had anticipated. Frank moved slowly to one of the chairs, his cane tapping against the floor with each measured step. Despite his age, there was still something unmistakably military about his bearing. The way he held his shoulders, the precise movements, the alert eyes that seemed to catalog everything around him. These were the habits of a lifetime spent in special operations. As they settled around the table, Rodriguez couldn't contain his questions any longer. "Sir, if your unit was operating in 1943, that means you were conducting special operations before most people even knew such things were possible. What kind of missions were you running?" Frank's eyes took on a distant look as if he was seeing events from decades past. "We started in the Mediterranean," he began, his voice steady despite the obvious emotion behind his words. "The Germans had fortified every major port from Gibraltar to Turkey. Conventional naval forces couldn't get close enough to gather intelligence or conduct sabotage operations. That's where we came in." He paused, reaching into his shirt pocket to pull out a small worn photograph. The black and white image showed a group of young men in military gear, standing on what appeared to be the deck of a submarine. They looked impossibly young, probably in their early 20s, but their eyes held the same intensity that the SEALs recognized in their own mirrors. This was taken in 1944, somewhere off the coast of Italy, Frank continued, sliding the photograph across the table. We had just completed a mission to map the underwater defenses at a German naval base. Took us 3 days of swimming at night, using equipment that would seem primitive by today's standards. Chen picked up the photograph, studying the faces carefully. In the center of the group, he could make out a younger version of Frank, recognizable despite the passage of 7 decades. How did you develop your techniques? There weren't any training manuals for this kind of work. Frank chuckled, a sound that held both pride and sadness. We wrote the manual as we went along, son. Every mission taught us something new about underwater infiltration, about working in hostile territory, about survival. We learned from our mistakes, and unfortunately, we learned from our losses. Williams leaned forward, fascinated despite himself. What kind of equipment did you use? How did you stay underwater for extended periods? Primitive rebreathers, mostly, Frank replied. Nothing like the sophisticated gear you have today. We used modified diving equipment that had been designed for commercial underwater work, not military operations. The rebreathers were unreliable and dangerous, but they didn't leave bubble trails that would give away our position. He gestured toward his tattoo again. See these small symbols here? The ones that look like circles with lines through them? Those represented successful missions using underwater approach. Each man kept track of his operations this way. It was our own private code. Patterson studied the tattoo more closely, now able to see the individual symbols that Frank was pointing out. How many missions did you complete, sir? Frank's expression grew serious. 47 underwater infiltrations, 23 sabotage operations, and countless reconnaissance missions. We operated in the Mediterranean, the North Sea, and eventually in the Pacific after Germany surrendered. Each mission was different. Each one taught us something new about what was possible. Commander Mitchell had been listening quietly, but now she spoke up. Frank, tell them about the Pacific operations. I think they need to understand how your work evolved. Frank nodded, his eyes growing even more distant. When the war shifted focus to Japan, we were transferred to the Pacific Theater. The Japanese had created underwater obstacles and defenses that were unlike anything we had encountered in Europe. They had studied German techniques and improved on them, creating challenges that required us to develop entirely new approaches. He stood up slowly, moving to a wall map that showed the Pacific Ocean. Despite his age, his knowledge of geography was still sharp. We operated here, he said, pointing to various islands, and here, places that don't appear in most history books, operations that were never officially acknowledged. Rodriguez joined him at the map. Were you involved in preparation for the major amphibious landings? Among other things, Frank replied cryptically. We would go in weeks before the main forces, sometimes months before. We mapped underwater approaches, identified and disabled obstacles, gathered intelligence on defensive positions. By the time the Marines hit the beaches, we had already been there many times. Chen was beginning to understand the scope of what they were hearing. Sir, you're describing operations that were essentially the foundation for modern SEAL tactics. Beach reconnaissance, underwater demolition, long-range infiltration. Frank turned back to face the group, a slight smile on his weathered face. You boys think you invented these techniques, but we were doing them 70 years before you were born. The difference is we were making it up as we went along. You have the benefit of all our trial and error, all our successes and failures. Williams asked the question that was on everyone's mind. Why hasn't any of this been in our training materials? Why don't we learn about the maritime unit in SEAL history? Frank's expression grew somber again. Because officially we never existed. The OSS was disbanded after the war, and all our records were classified at levels that kept them buried for decades. The men who created the modern SEALs knew about us, but they couldn't acknowledge us without revealing operations that were still considered sensitive. Commander Mitchell added, the classification levels on maritime unit operations weren't downgraded until just a few years ago. Frank is one of the first veterans who has been cleared to discuss these missions openly. Patterson looked around the table at his teammates, seeing his own amazement reflected in their faces. Sir, what was it like? Operating without any official support, without any recognition? Frank was quiet for a long moment before answering. We knew we were pioneers, he said finally. We knew we were creating something that would outlast the war, something that would become part of the Navy's future. That knowledge kept us going through the hardest missions, through the losses, through the years of silence afterward. He sat back down, his hands resting on his cane. We weren't doing it for glory or recognition. We were doing it because our country needed us to push the boundaries of what was possible. We were doing it because young men like you would someday need the techniques we were developing. The room fell silent again as the SEALs absorbed this perspective on their heritage. They had always known that their traditions ran deep, but they were discovering roots that went much deeper than they had ever imagined. Frank reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small, leather-bound notebook that looked as weathered as its owner. The cover was worn smooth from decades of handling, and the pages had yellowed with age. He placed it carefully on the table, treating it with the reverence usually reserved for sacred objects. "This contains techniques that were never officially documented," he said, his voice taking on a tone of great seriousness. "Methods we developed through trial and error, sometimes through desperation. Things that worked when conventional approaches failed." Commander Mitchell leaned forward, her interest clearly piqued. She had heard rumors about lost techniques from the early days of special operations, but she had never seen any documentation. "Frank, are you sure you're cleared to share this information?" Frank nodded slowly. "I've been cleared to share these techniques with active SEAL teams. The Navy wants to ensure that hard-won knowledge isn't lost forever." He opened the notebook carefully, revealing pages covered in precise handwriting, detailed diagrams, and what appeared to be tactical sketches. Rodriguez moved closer to get a better look at the pages. The writing was incredibly detailed, with measurements, timing calculations, and step-by-step procedures that looked more like scientific formulas than military tactics. "Sir, what exactly are these techniques?" "Underwater approach methods that allow for extended operations without detection," Frank replied, turning to a page filled with diagrams of breathing apparatus modifications. "We developed ways to stay submerged for up to 6 hours using equipment that was officially rated for only 90 minutes. Chen's eyes widened. Even with modern equipment, 6-hour underwater operations were extremely challenging and dangerous. "How did you manage that with 1940s technology?" Frank's finger traced one of the diagrams as he explained. "We learned to modify the rebreathers in ways that the manufacturers never intended. Small changes that increased efficiency without compromising safety. We also developed breathing techniques that reduced oxygen consumption by almost 30%. He turned to another page, this one showing detailed sketches of underwater navigation methods. GPS didn't exist in our day, obviously. We had to develop ways to navigate underwater using magnetic compasses, underwater landmarks, and timing. We could infiltrate a target area in complete darkness and emerge within 50 feet of our intended position." Williams studied the navigation diagrams with fascination. Modern SEALs had sophisticated electronics to aid in underwater navigation, but these men had accomplished similar results using only basic instruments and careful planning. "This level of precision seems almost impossible without modern equipment." "It required extensive training and absolute attention to detail," Frank replied. "We spent months learning to read underwater currents, to identify bottom composition by feel, to estimate distance traveled by counting fin kicks. Every sense had to be trained to operate in conditions where traditional navigation was impossible." Patterson was particularly interested in a page that appeared to show techniques for underwater communication. "Sir, how did you coordinate operations when you couldn't use radio communications underwater?" Frank's expression grew animated as he explained one of his favorite techniques. "We developed a system of underwater signals using light and touch that allowed team members to communicate complex information without breaking the surface. Watch this." Despite his age, Frank demonstrated a series of hand signals that were unlike anything the SEALs had seen in their training. The movements were precise and economical, designed to be visible in low-light underwater conditions while remaining undetectable to enemy observers. These signals could convey tactical information, navigation instructions, even emergency procedures, Frank continued. "We could coordinate a complex multi-team operation entirely underwater, with precise timing and coordination." Commander Mitchell was taking notes as Frank demonstrated the techniques. "Frank, have you shown these methods to any other SEAL teams?" "You're the first," Frank replied. "I've been waiting for the right opportunity, the right team. Commander Mitchell told me about your unit's upcoming training cycle, and I thought these techniques might be valuable for your advanced operations." Chen raised his hand slightly, a gesture of respect from one warrior to another. "Sir, would you be willing to teach us these techniques? To spend time with our team during our next training rotation?" Frank's eyes brightened at the suggestion. "Son, I've been hoping someone would ask me that question for the past 5 years. I have knowledge that dies with me unless I pass it on to the next generation. I'd be honored to work with your team." Rodriguez was studying another page in the notebook, this one showing what appeared to be improvised explosive devices made from common materials. "Sir, these demolition techniques, they look incredibly sophisticated for their time." "We had to be creative," Frank explained. "We couldn't always count on having proper military explosives available. We learned to make effective demolition charges from materials that could be found in any port city. Fertilizer, fuel, even certain types of soap could be combined to create powerful explosives." He turned to a page filled with chemical formulas and mixing ratios. "This knowledge saved our lives on more than one occasion when we were operating behind enemy lines with minimal equipment. Sometimes improvisation was the difference between mission success and total failure." Williams was beginning to understand the true value of what Frank was offering. "Sir, this isn't just historical information. These are practical techniques that could be useful in modern operations." "Exactly," Frank confirmed. "Military technology has advanced tremendously, but the fundamental challenges of underwater special operations remain the same. You still need to move undetected, navigate precisely, communicate silently, and accomplish your mission with limited resources." Patterson looked up from the notebook with obvious admiration. "Sir, why did you wait so long to share this information?" "Why now?" Frank's expression grew thoughtful. "For decades I couldn't share any of this because of classification restrictions. When those restrictions were finally lifted, I had to decide whether the knowledge was still relevant. After watching modern SEAL operations and seeing the challenges you face, I realized that some of our old techniques might still have value." He paused, looking around the table at each of the young SEALs. "But more than that, I realized that I have a responsibility to ensure that the lessons we learned, sometimes at great cost, aren't lost forever." Every technique in this notebook was paid for with blood, sweat, and sacrifice. That kind of knowledge is too valuable to take to the grave. Commander Mitchell closed her own notebook and looked directly at Frank. "Frank, on behalf of this team and the Naval Special Warfare community, I want to thank you for your willingness to share this knowledge. Would you be available to begin training sessions next week?" Frank smiled, the first genuinely happy expression they had seen from him since he arrived. "Commander, I've been ready for 70 years. Let's get started." The following week brought changes to Team 7's training routine that none of them could have anticipated. Frank Morrison arrived at the naval base each morning at 600 hours, despite his age moving with the punctuality that marked a career military man. He had traded his civilian clothes for a modified wetsuit that accommodated his elderly frame, and carried a small bag containing equipment that looked like museum pieces, but functioned with surprising effectiveness. The first training session took place in the base's diving facility, a controlled environment where the SEALs could learn Frank's techniques without the risks associated with open water operations. As they gathered around the pool, Frank's demeanor shifted noticeably. The quiet, reflective old man was replaced by a focused instructor who commanded immediate respect. "Before we get in the water," Frank began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had trained countless warriors, "I want you to forget everything you think you know about underwater operations. The techniques I'm going to teach you were developed under life and death conditions, where failure meant capture or death." Rodriguez raised his hand. "Sir, should we be concerned about conflicts with our current training protocols?" Frank smiled, appreciating the thoughtful question. "Son, what I'm teaching you won't replace your current training. Think of it as additional tools for your toolkit. There may come a time when modern equipment fails, when standard procedures aren't adequate, when you need techniques that your enemies don't expect." He walked to the edge of the pool, moving with surprising grace for a man his age. "The first technique I want to show you is called ghost breathing. It's a method of extending underwater operations by reducing oxygen consumption through controlled respiration and meditation techniques." Patterson looked skeptical. "Sir, we've been trained in combat breathing techniques, but extending underwater operations significantly seems impossible." Frank interrupted with a knowing look. "That's what my commanding officer said in 1943. Then I demonstrated the technique by staying underwater for 4 hours during a training exercise. He never questioned my methods again. Frank settled into the water with movements that suggested decades of underwater expertise. Despite his age, he moved through the water with fluid efficiency that impressed the watching seals. The key is understanding that panic and stress consume oxygen at an exponential rate. By controlling your mental state, you can reduce your body's oxygen demands dramatically. Chen watched carefully as Frank demonstrated the breathing pattern. Sir, this looks similar to techniques used in freediving, but adapted for tactical applications. Exactly, Frank confirmed. We studied every available source of underwater expertise, including pearl divers from Japan and sponge divers from Greece. We took their techniques and modified them for military purposes. Over the next hour, Frank guided each SEAL through the ghost breathing technique. The results were remarkable. Williams, who typically could stay underwater for 12 minutes using standard techniques, managed 18 minutes on his first attempt with Frank's method. Rodriguez achieved even better results, extending his underwater time by almost 50%. The mental component is crucial, Frank explained as they took a break. Fear and anxiety are the enemies of extended underwater operations. We developed meditation techniques that could be used even during combat situations, methods of achieving calm focus while under extreme stress. The afternoon session moved to navigation techniques. Frank had brought several pieces of vintage equipment, including a compass that looked like it belonged in a maritime museum. Modern GPS and electronic navigation are excellent tools, he said. But what happens when they fail? When you're operating in an environment where electronic signals are jammed or unreliable? Patterson examined the old compass with interest. Sir, how accurate were these navigation methods? Modern operations require precision that seems impossible with such basic equipment. Frank's response was to propose a challenge. Pick a target anywhere in the harbor at least 2 miles away. I'll navigate there underwater using only this compass and my techniques, and I guarantee I'll surface within 30 feet of the target. The SEALs exchanged glances. It seemed impossible, but Frank's confidence was absolute. Commander Mitchell, who had been observing the training session, stepped forward. Frank, with respect, that's an extraordinary claim. Are you certain you want to attempt this demonstration? Commander, I've been making this same demonstration for 70 years, Frank replied with a slight smile. Pick your target. Chen pointed to a navigation buoy approximately 2.5 miles across the harbor. That buoy, sir. Can you navigate to it underwater and surface within 30 feet? Frank nodded, making mental calculations that drew on decades of experience. Give me 5 minutes to study the current conditions and wind patterns, then start your timer. What followed was a masterclass in underwater navigation that none of the SEALs would ever forget. Frank spent exactly 5 minutes studying the water surface, checking wind direction, and making observations that seemed to involve instincts developed over a lifetime of underwater operations. Then he disappeared beneath the surface with only his vintage compass and his decades of experience. The SEALs tracked his progress using modern sonar equipment, watching his course corrections and marveling at his consistent bearing. Despite underwater currents that should have thrown off his navigation, Rodriguez monitored the timer while Williams tracked Frank's position relative to the target buoy. 47 minutes after Frank submerged, he surfaced 22 feet from the target buoy. The precision was so remarkable that the SEALs initially suspected equipment malfunction. When they verified the results, the implications were staggering. How is that possible? Chen asked as they helped Frank back into the boat. You were underwater for almost an hour, navigating by compass alone, and you hit the target with precision that rivals GPS navigation. Frank was breathing heavily, but showed no signs of distress from the extended underwater operation. Son, when your life depends on navigation accuracy, you develop techniques that seem impossible to people who rely on electronic aids. I learned to read underwater currents like a roadmap, to use bottom composition and water temperature changes as navigation references. Williams shook his head in amazement. Sir, this changes everything we thought we knew about the limitations of underwater navigation. These techniques could be invaluable for operations in GPS-denied environments. That's exactly why I wanted to share them, Frank replied. Modern technology is powerful, but it can fail. When it does, you need techniques that depend only on human skill and experience. Patterson was already thinking about tactical applications. Sir, If these navigation techniques are this accurate, what other capabilities did your unit develop that might still be relevant today? Frank's expression grew serious. Tomorrow, I'll show you underwater communications techniques that allow coordination between team members over distances of up to half a mile. No electronic equipment required, completely undetectable by enemy monitoring. As they headed back to shore, each SEAL was processing the implications of what they had witnessed. Frank Morrison wasn't just sharing historical information. He was revealing capabilities that could revolutionize modern special operations. The old man's tattoo had led them to discoveries that would change how they approached their most challenging missions. 3 weeks into Frank's training program, Team 7 had transformed into something unprecedented in modern SEAL operations. They were combining cutting-edge technology with techniques that predated the official establishment of their unit by 2 decades. The results were remarkable, and word was beginning to spread throughout the naval special warfare community. Commander Mitchell had been documenting every training session, recognizing that they were witnessing the transfer of knowledge that could benefit the entire SEAL community. Frank's techniques were being verified, tested, and adapted for modern applications. The impact was so significant that senior officers from other SEAL teams had begun requesting demonstrations. On this particular morning, Frank arrived with a somber expression that immediately caught the attention of the team. He moved more slowly than usual, and there was something in his demeanor that suggested he had difficult news to share. As the SEALs gathered for their morning briefing, Frank asked for a moment to address them. "Boys," he began, his voice carrying more weight than usual, "I need to tell you something that I've been keeping to myself. 3 months ago, my doctors discovered that I have pancreatic cancer. They've given me somewhere between 3 and 6 months to live." The briefing room fell completely silent. The SEALs had grown deeply attached to their elderly instructor over the past few weeks, and the news hit them like a physical blow. Rodriguez was the first to find his voice. "Sir, are there treatment options? Things that might extend—" Frank held up his hand gently, stopping the question. "Son, I'm 91 years old. I've lived through a world war, seen the birth of modern special operations, and now I've had the privilege of passing on my knowledge to the finest warriors in the world. I'm not afraid of what comes next." Patterson struggled to process the information. "Sir, this means our training time is limited. Is there anything we can do to accelerate the knowledge transfer?" Frank's expression brightened slightly at the question. "Actually, that's why I'm telling you this now. I want to arrange something special, something that will ensure these techniques survive and spread throughout the SEAL community." Commander Mitchell leaned forward, her command instincts engaging. "What do you have in mind, Frank?" "I want to conduct a final demonstration," Frank replied, his voice gaining strength as he spoke about his plan. "A comprehensive exercise that showcases every technique I've taught you, plus some advanced methods that I haven't shared yet. I want to invite senior leadership from Naval Special Warfare Command to witness what's possible when modern training combines with historical knowledge." Chen understood the implications immediately. "Sir, you're talking about creating an official record of these techniques, ensuring they become part of standard SEAL training protocols." "Exactly," Frank confirmed. "I don't want this knowledge to die with me. I want it to become part of your heritage, part of what makes future SEALs even more capable than they already are." Williams asked the practical question that was on everyone's mind. "What kind of demonstration are you envisioning? What would showcase these techniques most effectively?" Frank's eyes took on the intense focus that the SEALs had learned to recognize when he was planning something extraordinary, a live exercise that demonstrates every major technique we've covered. Extended underwater operations, precision navigation without electronics, underwater communications, improvised demolitions, and tactical approaches that your enemies wouldn't expect. Rodriguez felt a mixture of excitement and concern. "Sir, given your health situation, is it wise to attempt such a comprehensive demonstration?" Frank's response carried the unmistakable tone of a warrior who had made his decision. "Son, I've been preparing for this demonstration my entire life. Every mission I ran during the war, every technique I developed, every lesson I learned was leading to this moment. I'm not going to let a little cancer stop me from completing my final mission." Commander Mitchell was already thinking about the logistics and implications. "Frank, this would need to be coordinated at the highest levels. We're talking about inviting admirals and senior staff to witness techniques that have been classified for decades. I've already been in contact with Admiral Richardson at Naval Special Warfare Command, Frank replied. He's given provisional approval for the demonstration, pending details about what exactly we're planning to show. Patterson looked around the table at his teammates, seeing his own determination reflected in their faces. Sir, what do you need from us? How can we help make this demonstration successful? Frank smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. I need you boys to be the best SEALs you've ever been. This demonstration will test every skill you've learned from me, plus all your modern training. You'll be representing not just yourselves, but the entire heritage of underwater special operations. Chen was already thinking about the technical challenges involved. Sir, what specific scenarios are you planning for the demonstration? Frank opened his weathered notebook one final time, turning to pages that he had never shown them before. We'll start with a night infiltration exercise, approaching a simulated enemy facility using only 1940s-era equipment and techniques. Then we'll demonstrate underwater demolition using improvised explosives, followed by exfiltration under pursuit conditions. Williams studied the new pages with fascination. Sir, these scenarios look incredibly complex. How much time do we have to prepare? 2 weeks, Frank replied simply. Admiral Richardson wants to see the demonstration before the end of the month. That gives us 14 days to prepare for what will essentially be my final examination as an instructor. Rodriguez felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. Sir, we won't let you down. Whatever it takes to make this demonstration successful, we'll do it. Frank's expression grew serious again as he looked around the table at each young SEAL. Boys, I want you to understand something. This demonstration isn't just about showcasing techniques or impressing senior officers. It's about ensuring that the sacrifices made by my generation continue to have meaning. He paused, gathering his thoughts carefully. Every man who died developing these techniques, every warrior who pushed the boundaries of what was possible, every operator who served in silence without recognition, they all deserve to have their contributions remembered and built upon. Patterson felt a chill as he understood the full significance of what Frank was proposing. Sir, this is about more than just training techniques. This is about honoring the legacy of everyone who came before us. Now you're beginning to understand, Frank confirmed. This demonstration will be my final gift to the SEAL community, but more importantly, it will be my final tribute to the men who didn't live to see their innovations become part of official training. Commander Mitchell stood up, her decision made. Frank, you have our complete support. Whatever resources you need, whatever preparation time is required, we'll make it happen. This demonstration will be worthy of the legacy you're representing. As the briefing concluded, each SEAL felt the weight of history settling on their shoulders. They were about to participate in something that would bridge 7 decades of special operations heritage, connecting the hidden heroes of World War II with the modern warriors who carried on their traditions. The morning of the demonstration arrived with perfect conditions: calm seas, minimal wind, and the kind of visibility that would allow the assembled senior officers to witness every detail of what Frank and Team 7 had prepared. Admiral Richardson had arrived the previous evening, along with commanders from 3 other SEAL teams and senior staff from Naval Special Warfare Command. Frank appeared at the briefing room at 0500 hours, 2 hours before the scheduled demonstration. Despite his declining health, he moved with the purposeful energy of a man who was about to complete the most important mission of his life. He wore a vintage wetsuit that had been carefully maintained for decades, and carried equipment that represented the evolution of underwater special operations from World War II to the present day. Team 7 assembled around him with the quiet intensity that marked elite warriors preparing for a critical operation. Over the past 2 weeks, they had trained harder than ever before, pushing themselves to master techniques that combined Frank's historical knowledge with their modern expertise. They were ready to demonstrate capabilities that would revolutionize how the SEAL community approached certain types of operations. Commander Mitchell conducted the final briefing, outlining the demonstration scenario for the assembled senior officers. Gentlemen, what you're about to witness represents the culmination of 3 months of training that has combined techniques from the OSS Maritime Unit with modern SEAL capabilities. The scenario involves a night infiltration of a simulated enemy facility, underwater demolition using improvised explosives, and exfiltration under pursuit conditions. Admiral Richardson asked the question that was on everyone's mind. Commander, what makes this demonstration different from standard SEAL training exercises? Frank stepped forward to answer, his voice carrying the authority of 7 decades of special operations experience. Admiral, your modern SEALs are superbly trained and equipped, but they rely heavily on technology that can fail or be compromised. What I've taught these men are techniques that depend only on human skill and basic equipment, capabilities that work regardless of technological constraints. As the briefing concluded, the group moved to the harbor where the demonstration would take place. The target was a decommissioned ship anchored 2 miles offshore, rigged with sensors that would detect any approach and measure the precision of the simulated demolition charges. The challenge was designed to test every technique that Frank had taught the team. Patterson, Rodriguez, Chen, and Williams entered the water as the sun set, using equipment that was intentionally basic to showcase the techniques Frank had developed. They carried vintage rebreathers, magnetic compasses, and demolition materials that could be assembled from common commercial supplies. Modern observers tracked their progress using sonar and underwater cameras. What followed was a masterclass in underwater special operations that left the watching senior officers speechless. The team approached the target using Frank's navigation techniques, maintaining perfect coordination through underwater communication methods that required no electronic equipment. Their movements were precise, efficient, and completely undetectable to the monitoring systems designed to simulate enemy sensors. Rodriguez executed the demolition placement with timing and precision that demonstrated months of training in Frank's improvised explosive techniques. The charges were positioned with mathematical accuracy that would have been impressive using modern equipment, but was extraordinary using 1940s-era methods. Chen and Williams conducted the exfiltration phase under simulated pursuit conditions, using evasion techniques that Frank had developed during actual wartime operations. They demonstrated capabilities that seemed to bend the laws of physics, staying underwater longer than should have been possible, and navigating with accuracy that rivaled GPS-guided systems. Throughout the demonstration, Frank provided commentary that helped the senior officers understand what they were witnessing. Gentlemen, these techniques were developed under conditions where failure meant death or capture. Every method you're seeing was tested in actual combat operations against enemies who were actively trying to kill the operators. Admiral Richardson was taking detailed notes, recognizing that he was witnessing capabilities that could transform naval special warfare operations. Frank, the precision and endurance these men are demonstrating is remarkable. How quickly could these techniques be incorporated into standard training protocols? Frank's response reflected decades of thinking about this exact question. Admiral, with proper instruction and adequate training time, any SEAL team could master these techniques within 6 months. The key is understanding that these aren't just alternative methods, they're fundamental capabilities that every special operator should possess. As Team 7 surfaced near the target ship, having completed every phase of the demonstration flawlessly, the assembled senior officers erupted in spontaneous applause. What they had witnessed was more than just a training demonstration. It was a revelation about the untapped potential that existed within the SEAL community. Patterson was the first to speak as the team regrouped. Sir, that was the most challenging and rewarding operation I've ever participated in. These techniques don't just enhance our capabilities, they fundamentally change what's possible. Frank's satisfaction was evident as he watched the young SEALs who had become his legacy. Boys, you've just demonstrated that the spirit of innovation and excellence that defined the maritime unit is alive and well in the modern SEAL community. You've honored every warrior who came before you. Admiral Richardson approached Frank with obvious respect. Frank, on behalf of Naval Special Warfare Command, I want to thank you for sharing this knowledge. We're prepared to incorporate these techniques into advanced training programs immediately. Your contribution to our community is immeasurable. Frank nodded slowly, the weight of his completed mission evident in his expression. Admiral, these techniques belong to every SEAL who will face impossible odds and need every possible advantage. I'm honored to have been able to pass them on to warriors who will use them to protect our nation. Commander Mitchell stepped forward with an announcement that surprised everyone. Frank, Naval Special Warfare Command has decided to establish the Morrison Advanced Underwater Operations School in your honor. Your techniques will be taught to selected SEAL teams as part of an elite training program. The emotion on Frank's weathered face was unmistakable as he processed this unexpected honor. "Ma'am, I never expected recognition. I just wanted to ensure that valuable knowledge wasn't lost forever." Rodriguez spoke for the entire team when he said, "Sir, you've given us more than just techniques. You've connected us to our heritage and shown us capabilities we never imagined were possible. Every SEAL who learns these methods will carry forward your legacy." As the demonstration concluded and the group returned to shore, Frank Morrison had achieved something that few warriors ever experience. He had seen his life's work validated and ensured that his contributions would benefit future generations. The old man with the mysterious tattoo had revealed secrets that would enhance American special operations capabilities for decades to come. 3 weeks later, Frank passed away peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by members of Team 7 who had become like sons to him. His techniques were already being incorporated into SEAL training programs, and his legacy was secured in the capabilities of every warrior who would benefit from his knowledge. The tattoo that had started as a curiosity had led to the discovery of a hero whose contributions had been hidden for 70 years. Frank Morrison's final mission was complete, and his impact on naval special warfare would endure forever.